Hi, welcome. I did something different. I went back and added something, so I'm anxious to show you and talk about why I did that. And I also will be talking about how unique our weaving is as far as weaving down. There's only a few cultures in this world who continue to weave the twining technique and weaving down. The Maori people are an important weaving group that has retained this traditional weaving, and I'll talk a little bit about how I feel about our connections, the Northwest Coast people and the Maori people. So that's what I'll be talking as I weave today. Again, thank you for being here. So in Raven's Tail, I think I touched on it earlier, but in Raven's Tail, you do not have to have braids that surround all colored areas. Like here, I used a Nahine technique, and I needed to use braids to smooth the edges of this shape. And so I used a technique called the 3-strand braided twine. Here, when I was doing this, the black, white, copper, white, black, blue, these braids, I used a raven's tail technique. Down here where it's turning to go vertical, I began to use the Nahine technique of the braided 3-strand. Here I'm using a raven's tail technique braid. Now that you're looking at this, you can see I added copper this morning on the top of this. I have a very nice copper embroidery thread, and it's real metal, but it's made to be worked with cloth, so it won't damage the wool. But anyway, I didn't like the fact that the small blue band melded right into my next design. And it didn't have anything to delineate it from this design. But this blue band actually is part of the upper design here. It isn't part of this lattice pattern. And that wasn't really clear, and that's okay. Traditionally, it would have been okay not to have anything to delineate this with the next pattern area. That is a traditional, like right here, this 3-strand did not extend over to visually cut this top horizontal, all my ancestors. And then when it turns into the tree shadow, there's no 3-strand that delineates that turn, that change of from horizontal to vertical. It's a continuous pattern that has no 3-strand that visually stops you there. And that's traditional. You'll see a lot of robes where an upper pattern doesn't jive or meld with the lower pattern, and it isn't separated by a braid. Separating these inner patterns by braids is not absolutely necessary, because in Raven's Tail, not everything has braids surrounding it. But this bugged me. I didn't like how the blue spilled right into the lattice. And when I was looking at it, I was thinking, well, I could go back and put white in there. But then I kept thinking, I thought the white would be too stark. I didn't like that idea of the white. So this robe has copper in it. I have copper 3-strand up here. I have copper within the outlines here. And I thought copper would be a good, very subtle way of keeping the concept of the lattice, keeping it down and not having any confusion as to where this thin blue border, I want it to definitely be thought of as part of this row of designs and not part of the lattice. So my artistic decision here was to put some copper threads in the tops where the blue went into the lattice pattern. So that was my addition today for that. And I wanted to talk to you today about the similarities between the Maori people and their weaving and the Haida people, or the Northwest Coast people. Even the Maori people, in some of their thinking, is that they did have ancestors that came from the Northwest Coast. And anyway, in my research, I have found, even studying the myths and stories that were collected in the 1900s, there's this one story, and I'm not sure what story it is, or I could look it up, but in my research about the robes, I found this one story that talked about a daughter and a father and a suitor. And so the man wants to marry the chief's daughter. So one time when the chief's daughter was out gathering food, or away from the village and away from the father, the suitor, okay, I don't want to do anything wrong here. So I'm going to go back and make sure I've got the right pattern row. I'm doing the right pattern row. Okay, so the daughter is gathering and away from the village, and the suitor, the man who wants to marry her, follows her in secret, and she doesn't know he's there. She is accompanied by a couple of servants, and they're big guys. So the man keeps on trying to get a time when the servants aren't around. So he comes up with a trick to trick the servants to get out of the picture. And then when they're gone, he grabs the chance to confront and introduce himself to the bride, to the person he hopes to be his bride. So he jumps at her, and she's about ready to scream. And he places his nose up to her nose. And that is a way of greeting. And it was a familiar way for the lady. So she was calmed. Her fears were calmed by that greeting, where he came and he touched her nose, and then he talked to her about marrying him and going off with him and so forth. But that isn't the only place where I've seen or heard of the Northwest Coast people having that tradition of greeting and sharing breath with touching the nose, and And the Maori people have that in their cultures. So that was really interesting. So, and another thing is we weave down. Like I mentioned that the Maori people weave down. Their bar is, sometimes it's a string. If it's a smaller object, they'll string their warps on a simple string that that is from one point, hangs from another point. But this working the weaving down is what they do, and I'm going to include a few pictures of some Maori, old Maori robes in this video, and you'll see the similarities in the robes design, and how the weaver sits in front of the loom. So, and they also have quite a lot of rules and taboos when it comes to weaving the robe and gathering their materials. They weave their robes out of plant fibers that they find on their island, and my sister and I were really fortunate enough to be able to spend a few days, well, more than a few days, but in a cultural center in, oh, now I can't remember the name of the cultural center there. Hopefully it'll come to me while I'm talking. But anyway, we went there. It was a cultural center, and I was recommended to go there by some carvers. They said, "Oh, come visit us," because I had met the Nichols. Oh, cheekers. 1, 2, 3, 4. Darcy Nichols and his brother I met in the Evergreen College during a Pacific Rim gathering of artists. And so when my sister and my husband and I, we were all going to go to New Zealand together. And I found out that they were having a weaving symposium down there. So I called ahead and said, is it possible that we could join in the weaving program? So it turned out that was very possible, and we took part of that consortium, and we presented. I even displayed my weaving there in the exhibit. It was to launch the Eternal Threads exhibit there. And it was such an honor to weave with these people. But before the conference, we had gone to this cultural center, and they said, go to the weaving house. Well, first of all, we went to the carving place. And then we said, where's the weaving house? And they said, oh, there. They showed us, they told us. And so off we went to see the weavers. And there was a lady, her name was Millie, and then another lady that I only know by calling her Auntie, because that's how I was introduced to her. So my sister Holly and I spent 2 days there with Millie and Auntie, and they honored us by showing us how they gather their materials, the flax that they use, and how they prepare it, how they scrape it with the mussel shell, and how they twine it, and how they they spin it, and they spin it just like we do on their thighs. So they scrape the outer plant material and reveal the inner white fibers that hold the flax plant so stiff in the wind, and they use that for their weaving. And so we learned from them their way of doing it, and it was so similar to our way of doing it that they were amazed at how quick we caught on. And I had to tell them, I was like, well, this is how we do it. And it was quite fun to work with them and to learn from them and to see the comparisons of how we weave our robes and the techniques of twining and spinning. It was all just really, really a fun time, and we were really quite honored for their time. And I have even more stories about that time, but I just want to say that learning the similarities was amazing. And even this technique I'm doing now, where I'm pulling the color I want up forward, well, they have a technique too, but in their techniques, they carry even more color. So they'll use they'll pull the colors they want up and all the colors they don't want, which might be up to 3 or 4 strands. And they use those 3 or 4 strands like we do with the rigid weft. They just keep them in the back until they need them, and then they pull them forward. I think it's Tanako. I'm really bad with language. I have a bad ear, so I'm pretty bad at saying the proper way of saying their technique. But anyway, their similarities are just amazing. And the Haidas, the Maoris, and I believe years ago, the Aleuts also had created their capes and their robes by weaving down. There also is, up in the Swedish Nordic countries, they, I believe, have retained a weaving down technique for some of their weaving. And then studying Greece, I saw a lot of times you'll see ancient Greek traditions painted on their vases, their vases, and so I did go to Greece, and I saw a lot of the vases, the paintings, and even in the subway, there was a display of ancient weaving material, looms, and they used a clay that held that. Ours is gravity weighted; nothing weighs these warps. But the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, did use a clay weight that was tied at the end of the warps. So they traditionally wove down. The Scottish tartan weavers, they used a technique of weaving down, and they also, in addition to weaving down, but they did weigh their warps, loosely tied down. But that is no longer. They don't use that any longer. So it's the Maoris and the Haidas that really, or the Northwest Coast weavers of these chief robes, we have maintained and retained the tradition of weaving down. So that's what I was going to say. Oh, I'd also like to point out, remember I was telling you the story about the fellow who he wrestled with the sky people, the cloud the cloud people. I've got to move this, so it's gonna. So when he went to wrestle with the cloud people, at the very end of the story, he did a dance of transformation. So he put on a dancing blanket, which I feel is the Naheen, the chilkat, the Naheen blanket. He put on a form line or a dancing blanket, what he was described as a dancing blanket, and he bent over and ran. So he ran bent over. And when he stood up, he transformed. And the Maori people, they have stories and traditions of transformation in that same manner, where they would be running and bending down and then stand up. So that ended up in one of our ancient stories, that way of transformation. And so we share that with the Maori people too. We're canoe people, and the Maori people have a group of a waka, or a group of people that have red hair, and they believe that those people, the original people, came on a separate canoe and landed at this place. And so now there's redheads in the Maori people, and there are redheads along our coast. The Haidas are very strong with the red-headed gene. So for the Maori people to also have that in their people, it just is. I think it's overwhelming, the cultural traditions that are similar. So that is my talk about the Maori and weaving down. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you learned something, and I hope you come back. Bye.